Okay, thank you. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, I'm unmuted. Welcome back, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us this afternoon. My name is John Hayworth. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I come from a family of storytellers. My first cousin, Margaret Verbal, whose first novel, Maud's Line, draws on family stories as source, as did her other novels, Cherokee America and When Two Feathers Flew from the Sky. Forgive me for this family plug, but I have to do these things. I am participating today from Brooklyn, New York, land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people, and I have their elders past and present and future generations in mind today. I also pay my respect to the indigenous people from eastern Oklahoma, where I grew up, where Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, and descendants of other nations who were forcibly removed from their traditional homelands. This symposium itself has a debt of gratitude to the complex history of Native America. We can look forward to being inspired this afternoon by storytellers Tim Tingle and Scott Momaday and lawyer Trevor Reed and Rumeli Bonnick from the Doris Duke Foundation, and a major advocate for our work. Shout outs to ATOM, to its dedicated staff and board, to our lead funder, Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and to all of the speakers from yesterday. Yes, indeed, yesterday was a productive, informative, and inspiring day. The repository presentations from the 7 universities were substantive and illuminating. Some of the key points that were takeaways and especially important included: Number 1, engaging tribal leaders and cultural experts is a shared priority of this project. Number 2, respect of protocols informs our work. These are complex issues to sort through, yet it is clear that we are all on the same page regarding community review and input at every step of this work. 3, the technological challenges are enormous. As are collection storage and access, this work requires great skill, lots of patience, and good humor along the way. Indeed, the work before us is time-consuming, it's labor-intensive, and it's challenging. Our discussions today will help us think strategically about the work ahead, the communication about the work, and creative action steps for our aspirations moving forward. Number 4, visibility, making certain that both tribal communities and scholars, both from within Native communities and beyond Native communities, is key to our individual and collective success. Bottom line, it is clear that given the high level of commitment and community engagement, which was expressed in every presentation yesterday, we are well positioned for yielding tangible results of this good work. There are many dots to connect. This project affords us the opportunity to deepen the level of community-based cultural work in substantive and tangible ways. ATOM, thank you, has given us the forum for asking the right questions, drawing on the knowledge and wisdom of one another, and sharing both our challenges and successes. This is a great opportunity for us to reveal deeper truths about our histories and understand the lived experiences of our ancestors. This project gives us opportunity to continue telling our stories from multiple perspectives and to share this both within Native communities and well beyond. There was repeated acknowledgement yesterday that the archival record of oral histories is important, as are the oral histories. The stories we continue to tell, they're worthy of our attention, of our respect, and our honor. The 4 questions put before us today for discussion address the nitty-gritty and practical issues of the challenges ahead. Funding, training, resources, technical assistance. What do we need to do to move forward? Leveraging. How can new life be given to the oral histories in the Doris Duke collections? What steps must Native communities take to use these materials? How might we encourage broad use of the materials within our communities and expanding scholarly interest in all of it? I sense that there's great agreement based on the comments and questions from yesterday that oral history projects have potential for all tribal communities. Yesterday, there were references to oral histories of Native veterans. What type of oral history projects are needed on a national basis? And let's ask, what Native museums, libraries, and cultural centers, and what nationally respected cultural institutions can be enlisted to advance this work and make it more widely known? Let's be bold. Hey, this group is a bold group. That was clear from all those presentations from the universities. In how we enlist ever higher levels of understanding and, yes, tangible financial support from federal agencies, from other funders, and from others to help us advance all the good work that all of you are doing. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Tim Tingle.
Yakoke, thank you, John. And thank you sincerely to those wonderful presenters yesterday. And also, before I give the blessing of the land, I would like to extend a sincere and heartfelt thanks to ATOM and to Susan Feller and Melissa Brott, who have been the foundation of ATOM from the very beginning. I would like now to give my blessing on the peoples. I am in Central Texas, those who lived and blessed this land with their homes and families before. The Caddo people, the Alabama and the Coshada people, the Comanche, the Apache, Karankawa, and the Tonkawa nations, and so many others we do not still know. Bless this land and bless the people and the spirits that still occupy it. Shilong is holy though by my is me people la cha hata kilba shapia is be yokapa laski. Yakoke, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, so much for that. Okay, well, my name is Melissa Brott, and I'm the Director of Programs for the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And I'm going to give you a quick demonstration on Jamboard, which is what we are using today to get our input from all of you. So give me one moment while I share my screen. Okay, so when you go into your breakout room, your wonderful team leaders will post the link to the Jamboard in the chat, and you will click on it and it will take you to this. When you get in here, there's a couple of quick things I'll show you. You'll see when you come in that we already have some sticky notes on here that of people who've provided input in advance. To make a sticky note, you come over here to the left and you post where the fourth one down where it says sticky note, click that and it just pops up and you can type in whatever you need. You can even change the color if you'd like. And then just click save and it automatically just pops right out. Then you can click away to get back to the Jamboard, or you can keep adding multiple post-it notes. Each listening session room has a manager, and the manager will actually move the post-its around. You're welcome to as well, especially like when you have a question that has multiple areas like funding, training, or resources, you know, pull your post-it to the area that you want it to go to. Each listening session has 4 questions, and to advance between questions, you'll come up here to the very top where you see the arrows, and you'll click next frame, and it will take you to the next question. One really important thing to remember is do not click clear frame, because clear frame will clear everything out, including the question and all the sticky notes. So please don't do that. You can also, like with your sticky note, you can, if you need to edit it, you can actually click the little 3 buttons here, click edit or delete it, whatever you need to do. So what we're going to do now is I am going to stop my share, and in just a minute or so, you will all be moved into breakout rooms. If you have any problem, you can always come back to the main room at any time. So just bear with me one moment and I will get all these open. And if you have any questions about Jamboard, when you get into your breakout rooms, your moderators also can answer any questions you have. Okay. All right. So I will see you shortly.
Just quickly, somebody asked.
Hi, Veronica. I see that you're still in the room. Great.
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Welcome back, everyone. I have the distinct pleasure and the honor of introducing Tim Tingle this afternoon. I want to reflect a little bit because over many years I have witnessed firsthand Tim's contributions to ATOM, especially his advocacy on behalf of libraries and librarians in Native communities, and an understanding that teachers are always looking for reading lists and good literature and all that. So one of the areas I look at the titles of his book, his, of course, is known for Walking the Choctaw Road, is known for Spooky Texas Tales, and on and on. He's written so much. He's been honored, especially for his work in young people's literature. And at a time when we're really investigating throughout our country the importance of literature, the importance of stories, the importance of youth development, I think that Tim is one of our best champions in the entire field. So with that, I welcome Tim. This is going to be a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Yakoke, for that wonderful introduction. And whenever I hear such a glorious introduction of myself, I always think of my Chickasaw mother, who is up in the beyond, but is always there with me. And exactly what she would say if she heard that introduction, she would look around at people sitting next to her and she would shake her head and say, Tim must have written that introduction for himself.
But you didn't.
No, I didn't. And I thank you. I thank you so much. And when I was invited to speak about the importance of oral history collections, access to the collections, and the collections themselves, right away, my mind goes back to the backyard of Minneotchitamagood, my Choctaw grandmother, who was born in a 50-acre farm in Oklahoma. And when she was 12, she was kidnapped and sold to a boarding school never saw her parents again. And she married my grandfather at a time when Native peoples were actually being killed without any law enforcement results. She married my Scotch-Irish grandfather and moved to Pasadena, Texas. And in the backyard of that little home where she had 250 chickens and collected eggs and horses and cattle, and in the backyard of that home on an old tree stump, my Uncle Kenneth would sit, and myself and all the cousins would surround him, and he would tell us stories. And we were allowed to speak some Choctaw, and we learned Get by Choctaw, I call it. And we could all sing Shalom V'Sholi Topama, Amazing Grace in Choctaw. But my grandmother always told us, she made us promise that once we stepped off of their property, we would never tell anyone we were Choctaw, never tell anyone we had a drop of Indian blood. She was so scared that what had happened to her could possibly happen to us. And I would never be telling stories or writing stories, except 2 years before she died, she called everyone together and she said, it's time we be proud of who we are. It's time we be proud. And I would go to libraries and I would seek books about Choctaws. And when my son got into the 5th grade and was for American history, I said, now he's going to learn the truth about us and what happened to us. Not a word, of course, not a word. And in many states, it's even worse now than it was then. So when I couldn't find Choctaw books, at first I thought I'll go back to Oklahoma. And then a good friend of mine, Doc Moore, who was a professor and also a storyteller, he said, you know, the Choctaws began in Mississippi. I'll go with you there. And so I began what lasted for 8 years, traveling to and from Mississippi at least 2 times a year. And often I would stay for a month, 6 weeks. I became friends with so many elder Choctaws there. And I began to record the stories of those who had somehow blended and disappeared into the woods, not to be removed. When I think of the importance of oral storytelling, without these oral stories that I began to share, I volunteered at my son's school and I began to tell true stories in 2nd grade. And then as it went older to middle grade, I could tell the truth about the Trail of Tears, about my great-great-great-grandfather. And this came from the mouth of Kenneth, my Uncle Kenneth, about his house was burned and as people fled from the homes they were shot at, and of the smallpox blankets, and of John, which became the English name. We never knew the Choctaw name because when you registered, it didn't go back. How he carried the bones of his mother who died from one of the smallpox blankets all the way. He carried them wrapped in a blanket to Oklahoma where she was buried. And those stories became so much a part of my life. The traditional stories and the fun stories, the rabbit tail stories, but also the true stories. And as I discovered in so many Native communities, that if you want the truth about what happened, about growing up, about the troubles, about the life, about the survival, you go to the elders and you somehow learn to listen. And here's something that I learned, and this is very important, I think, especially for tribal communities. I had friends. I would have a circle of friends, of people that were my age, a little older. And I would visit with them about their grandparents and elders that they knew. And rather than trying to set up an appointment and an interview session and invite elders to come to a library or a center and tape record their stories, I had done that. But what I learned was most effective. I found a young man who had been a friend for several years, Jay Mcilvane, who's lived in Oklahoma near Seminole. And Jay was always telling me about his grandfather. And I said, I would like to meet your grandfather sometime. Would he share stories? And he said, oh, I don't know. He said, I said, Jay, will you go with me and introduce me to your grandfather? And I'll bring a tape recorder, and he might want to share stories. He might not. We can see. And Jay said, that would be interesting. Let's see about that. So he set up a time. He said, Saturday morning, we'll show up about 10, and I'm bringing my friend, and we can have coffee together. And he might want to hear about some of your growing up experiences. He's a listener, And so we showed up at the door, and my friend knocked, and his father answered, and we went inside. And I also learned, rather than kind of going in with a particular agenda, with a briefcase or something that you pop on, okay, let's get this going. And where there's, no, you just go in. And when people say, hey, would you like to, you say yes, whatever it is, and enjoy it. That's part of the tradition. You're a guest and you're to be fed. But what I also learned after several different months or years was that the time to actually start my little recording device was before we knocked on the door. We would knock on the door, and I would hold a little cassette recorder at the time. And the person would answer, and I would say, just so you know, I've got this recorder going. So whatever we hear is going to be recorded. I hope that's okay, but don't worry about it. We can just, and they would kind of laugh and nod, because some of the most important cultural situations happen as things are being served in comments and the various household traditions within the culture. So I would plop the little recorder on the coffee table, whatever, and we would enjoy, and I would take everything would be recorded, and I'd have an extra cassette, pop it in. And then we finished our coffee or our drinks or our little cup of pashofa corn soup, whatever it was, I would ask a general question, something like, can you share something with me about growing up? What was that like? And then I would sit back and not say a word. I would not, originally, I lined out about 10 questions, and I would ask the question. When they would answer the question, I would check it, move on. I learned that doesn't work, because if you're interviewing a tribal elder that has, well, they all have stories to tell. Every one of us has stories, trouble stories we've tried to back away, whatever. Every one of us live in a world filled with stories of things that have happened to us and things we've seen. You don't even know the questions to ask. So I would just toss a general out there. What was it like growing up for you? Where were you? And then just lean back and listen and sip my coffee. And my goal, once maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes had started, and they kind of were nodding and looking back and closing their eyes, and then kind of smiling and coming out with it. Once that started, my goal was that there would be 30 minutes before I would hear my voice again. That if I made a comment and I made comments about the story, which I would do, but not often, I would seek 30 minutes of silence from my voice, because so often, especially with elders, silence is respected. It's not as if you're in a room with several people your age and people toss this out and comment and laugh and move. It's not like that at all. if you've ever seen a group of elders that are sitting in an older house on the front porch or something, there's so much quiet, so much silence, and you must learn to respect that silence. And speaking of silence and the importance of the oral, the Doris Duke collection is so critical, so critical. The transcripts and being able to read it, but the voice, the recordings. You can say certain things with the written word, the transcriptions, but there's so much that the transcription cannot communicate. The silences within sentences, the feeling and emotion that comes through the power of the human voice when someone is talking about their great-great-grandfather, a 10-year-old boy carrying the booms, or my grandmother is talking about being hit hard and knocked to the ground and standing up and knowing she could do nothing, and finally marrying my grandfather to get away and doing her best to protect us. The recordings I made, all those trips, I have 300 hours of recordings, and many of them have been transcribed. Many of them are still on cassette, and many are on CDs. One of the most important was a Choctaw man named Cecil Berry. And Cecil Berry, I met Cecil Berry at one of the Choctaw Cultural Centers at one of those storytelling gatherings. And Cecil Berry, he said, your last name is Tingle. Are you kin to the Carnes? And I said, well, yes, actually, John Carnes was my great. He was the one who walked on the Trail of Tears. And he said, did you ever hear of Clarence? And I said, well, yes, I've heard of Clarence Carnes. Wasn't he involved in Alcatraz? And he said, Cecil Berry's the name. I'm not going to tell you where I live. If you can find it out, make an appointment, I'll visit with you. And that was it. And 3 months later, after I'd found out where where Cecil Berry lived, I made my way to his house, and he told me the story of my great uncle, Clarence Carnes, who was involved in Alcatraz and the riot at Alcatraz, a riot in which the prisoners took over and they had guns, and he was sent in to kill a guard with a knife to pull his hair back and slice his throat. And he gave me this on a recording. And he looked at the man, and the man said, my wife and my family, please. And he did not kill him and went on out. And when there was a trial of all of the prisoners and everyone was sent to death for killing the guards, the guard he had let live because of his family came and testified. The power of the human voice, it saved Clarence Carnes, who made so many mistakes in his life. And still, at least once a year, I drive up to Oklahoma to the little town of Daisy to sing Amazing Grace over my great uncle's, over his gravestone. You all have stories. You all have stories. Seek the people out within your community that have those stories. Respect them. Find someone who knows them well enough that will let you visit them. Let them know the purpose of the visit, and listen and record the stories. The greatest stories you will ever hear. Many of them are written. Many of them are written, and many of them are not. But both the written word and the oral word are so important to the truth of Native history and Native life. Just to briefly end, I made an early recording called The Choctaw Way I made a recording of Choctaw Stories, and I had no intention of writing. And as I got a call, I gave it to a family I met at the State Library Association, and I got a call as they were driving. They said, "We were listening to your tape, and we want you to write a book of these stories." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yes, we'll publish it." And 2 years later, Walking the Choctaw Road came out. It came out because of the oral stories that I had collected and told. Yakoke, thank you so much for listening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as I end this session, my own session, I would like to introduce a person that has meant so much to my life and to thousands and thousands of others. Scott Momaday. Scott Momaday. I first read the book House of Dawn, an amazing book of literary genius that moves back and forth from perspectives. It's an astounding novel. And as I was looking through my library yesterday and finding all of the Momaday books, I found in The Bear's House with illustrations. I found The Man Made of Words. I found The Way to Rainy Mountain. I found an Scott Momaday storytelling recording, which is old. I found The Ancient Child, which is incredible and imaginative. And I found In the Presence of the Sun. And then as I was wondering about the introduction, I just flipped open a comparison of the written and oral traditions is, of course, a matter of great complexity. Writing defines the very terms of our existence. We cannot know what it is to exist within an oral tradition, or we cannot know entirely, but we can know more than we do, and it behooves us to learn as much as we can. And for those of you who have read everything that N. Scott Momaday ever wrote, I encourage you at this stage of your life to go back and read it again. Things take on a new meaning with age. Blessings to you, N. Scott Momaday.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply moved by your words, and words are what we're talking about today. I have spent most of my life teaching, and my principal course in teaching was the oral tradition. I became interested in that at a very tender age because my father, who was full-blood Kiowa, told me stories when I was very small, very little. And I loved those stories. I had him tell them to me again and again and again. These were stories from Kiowa oral tradition. And I took them for granted in the way that people do and should. But at some point in my adult life, I became convinced that these stories should be written down. And so I wrote a book called The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is basically not my book, but it belongs to the Kiowa people. It is a collection of their stories from oral tradition. And I learned a great deal in producing that book. But I had learned a great deal too from talking to my Kiowa relatives. My grandmother could speak no English, but she was a storyteller. And I can speak no Kiowa, but I learned from her through an interpreter that I learned something about the oral tradition, the way the mind works in the presence of language. That's very important to me. I'm very much interested in language, not in a particular language, not in French or German or Choctaw or any other language, but language in the abstract. I'm interested in the way that language began. How did it come about? Several years ago, I was invited to take part in a ceremony in Chicago, which is held, I think, annually. They bring all sorts of people together to talk about interesting things, and these are people who are greatly esteemed in their communities. They produce books and scholars of one kind and another. Well, I was on the stage with Richard Leakey, who is a paleoanthropologist of great renown. He lives in Kenya, and he studied the origins of man in Africa. And our subject that on that occasion was origins. And we came to the question: when did we become human? When did we become human beings? And Richard postulated the theory that we became humans when we became bipedal, when we could stand on our hind legs and reach for the fruit of the tree above us and so on, look over the grasses. And I thought, yeah, that's a good answer to the question. But Richard, I disagree with you. I think we became human when we acquired language. That made all the difference. That separated us once and for all from all other species on the face of the planet. Now, I've taught so many classes in oral tradition, and always I come upon a student who will say, "My dog can talk." And I say, well, no, he can't. Your dog can communicate, but he doesn't have language in the way that we have. We have a system of language. We have invented language in a sense. And so we're different in that respect from all other creatures. Well, in my classes in oral tradition, I've taught that I've compared oral and written traditions. There's a great deal to be said about that comparison, of course. We all write, we're all literate, I assume. And consequently, we don't know what the oral tradition is in the way that people who do not have writing know it. That's a critical difference to begin with. We need to point that out. We can write something down and we can put it away in a desk drawer. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We know that it'll be there when we come back for it. That gives us a false security where language is concerned. In the oral tradition, we don't have that security. Everything is always one generation removed from extinction. If I do not pass down a story to my children in the oral tradition, it will be lost. So that means that there are three things that are critically important to oral tradition. And they are speech, listening, and memory. One must speak responsibly. One must listen carefully. And one must remember what he hears. Otherwise, everything is lost. So those three things are critical. I tell my students that if you don't remember anything else in this class, remember those three things, because they do define the oral tradition for us. Now, I listened to my father tell stories when I was very small. I kept them in my mind. And when the time came, I transcribed them. That became the book, The Way to Rainy Mountain, which I think is a kind of primer to the oral tradition. it is an example of oral tradition in writing, if that makes sense to you. We can transcribe from the oral tradition, and it's a good thing that we can, because those things then become permanent and become books in libraries and so on. We need those things. But we also need to understand that the oral tradition is alive and well. Every day in our lives, we use the oral tradition. We all have an oral tradition, whether we know it or not. And we deal in it. We deal in it every day. Every day in our lives, we say something. We say things that have never been said before. Now, that you may not believe that, but it's true. It's true, and that indicates the originality of language. I remember that back in the 1960s, I think it was 1965, I was in Oklahoma with my Kiowa grandmother and other members of the family, and my father was there. My father, who was fluent in Kiowa, and I was looking around for stories to include in the Way to Rainy Mountain. So I was talking to old people in the tribe who knew the story, knew some of the story. And I collected some here and there. And every time I talked to someone, they said, you must talk to Kosan. You must talk to Kosan. She knows a great deal about Kiowa lore and language, and she can tell stories endlessly. And so I looked up this old woman, Kosan. My father and I invited her to my grandmother's house for a meal because I wanted so much to talk to her. And so one afternoon in Oklahoma, Kosan came to the arbor of my grandmother's house, and we feasted. We made her feel very welcome. We talked to her, and so on. And she sat on the edge of a bench in the arbor, and I began to question her in English. My father would translate, and I would say, "Kosan, grandmother, can you tell me something about the Sundance?" Because the last Kiowa Sundance was held in 1887, and there were at that time very few people who had attended a Sundance, and so none of us knew what the Sundance was in its details, but she did, because she had as a young girl she had attended the last Kiowa Sundance. And so I would ask her, "Grandmother, what can you tell me about the beginning of the Sundance? How did it begin each year? How what were the formalities of it?" And she inevitably would say, "Oh, grandson, don't ask me about that. Don't ask me about. No one knows about that. That's too far back in time." And after making that protestation, she would then tell me everything I wanted to know about it. And so I came to understand that this was a formula in the oral tradition. She must protest that she knows not the answer to these questions. And then she would tell me the answers to the question. Well, oh, grandson, it was beautiful, beautiful. The camps were all decorated with ribbons and drawings, paintings, and so on. And everybody was in his finery. It was so beautiful, so beautiful. And they constructed the Sundance Lodge Hall, and it was wonderful. It was beautiful, and everybody gathered in anticipation of the dance itself. And then I looked out across the landscape, and I saw this speck that was approaching. And as it drew nearer, I saw that it was a woman. An old woman. Oh, she had something on her back. She was carrying something on her back, and I didn't know what it was. I was just a little girl. And I asked my sister, my older sister, what is that? Who is that? What is that she's carrying? And my sister said, she's bringing the earth to the Sundance Lodge. The dancers must dance upon a particular kind of sandy earth, and that's what the old woman is bringing. And sure enough, the old woman approached, and she opened the bag, and she put the dirt down on the floor for the dancers to dance on. But as she was approaching the Sundance camp, and I was watching her approach, I saw her stop. She stopped and she put down the bag of earth, and she had a digging tool in her hand. It was something like a large spoon. And she pointed towards the south with her lips. It was like a kiss. And she began to sing. Now we have brought the earth. Now it is time to play. As old as I am, I still have the feeling of play. And that, Kosan said, was how the Sundance began every year. Well, I was so fascinated with this woman who was telling me these stories. I had never heard anything like that in my life. She was possessed of great energy, even though I asked her grandmother, how old are you? And she said, oh, I do not know. Oh, I think I'm 100 years old. And I'm sure she was 100 years, give or take a year or two, one in one direction or the other. She was an old woman, bent over and wrinkled. She had only one good eye, but she could talk. She could speak. She was in possession of the oral tradition, the Kiowa oral tradition. And that was such a wonderful thing for her to possess and for her to share with the rest of us. Well, I came to have, on occasions like that, a great understanding and appreciation of the oral tradition. And I think that in our time, in the present day, the best definition of the best example, I should say, of oral tradition is theater. We go to a play, and I have written plays. I love to see performances of plays. But when I see them, I understand that this is the best example of oral tradition that we have. So you have actors on a stage. They are speaking to each other. They are communicating at the level of the human voice. They're making gestures. They use body language. They have eye contact with the audience. These are important things in the oral tradition. And so, as I say, it is here. We all deal in an oral tradition. And that is a fascinating aspect of language. As a teacher, I have struggled to make my students understand something about the oral tradition. We don't have it as we once did. We talk about it, and we talk about it in the past. Well, people in those days had an oral tradition. Today we have writing. It's a great invention. And truly it is. I'm a writer, so I can understand the importance of writing. But I have accumulated over my lifetime a great devotion to the spoken word. In one Indian language or another, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but there is a formula that goes like this. In the beginning was the word, and it was spoken. I can't underestimate the importance of the spoken word. Now we have, television and radio recordings of one kind and another. And so we have the spoken word readily available to us. I'm a member of Audible on television or in podcasts, and so I listen to books that are being read by other people, and I myself have read several of my books for Audible. It's a wonderful thing to listen to a book being read. There are things in that process that we cannot achieve in writing by itself. So I have a great appreciation of Audible, and I have given you perhaps a kind of introduction to oral tradition as I understand it, and I think that it is valuable to talk about oral tradition, to teach oral tradition in our schools, and certainly I have instructed my own children in the value of oral tradition. And when we do talk to each other, I try to point out that this is what we are doing is something that is ancient. We don't know when language began, but we know that it is inestimably older than writing. And I sometimes think about some of the great literature that has come down as oral tradition, and then was transcribed into writing. For example, the Beowulf. The Beowulf is the oldest poem in the English language. And before it was written down, it was delivered orally by a scope or a priest who had committed the whole of that poem to memory. That was no easy feat. That required a great act of the memory. But I can imagine that back in the 7th century, there was in England a little village somewhere, maybe Northumbria, somewhere in England. And one day, the parents, the man and woman who lived in the house and who raised a child, they woke the child up early in the morning and they said, "Come, we're going to the forest. We're going to the forest. Something important is happening in the forest." The child, of course, rubbed his eyes and rubbed her eyes, blinked, and followed her parents out to this clearing in the woods. And there were people gathered all around, and there was an air of excitement. Something truly wonderful was going to happen. And after a time, this little man in a hood stepped out into the clearing and he began to recite the Beowulf. And the child was truly enchanted, and her life would never be the same again. I like to think of that because it was a great moment in human history. The discovery of ourselves really in story and in language. And so I think of that often. And I also think of the things I have read in anthologies of Native American story, John Bierhorst's books, which are anthologies of Native American writing and storytelling, oral tradition. There is one that stands out in my mind, and you probably know of it. It's called The Winged Serpent by Margot Astro. It's an older anthology of Native American things, but the introduction to that book is truly wonderful. And I strongly advise that if you're interested in oral tradition, you have a look not only at the contents that are transcriptions of Native American storytelling, but the introduction. The introduction tells you what you need to know about oral tradition. Well, I don't have the opportunity, I suppose, to answer questions that you may have, but I will try to anticipate a few of them. Dr. Momaday, what do you think is the power of language? What do you think is the power of language? I think the power of language is mystical and and started to say mischievous. And in some sense that is true. But it is also powerful in a magical way, You know, I once heard a young Kiowa man come. I invited him to come and speak to my class. And he said to the class, you know, if I held an eagle feather in my hand, and if I turned it over, you would all turn over. That would be a power that is attributable to the feather itself and what it represents in terms of the power of the bird and flight. But it also has to do with language, because I would tell it to turn over, and it would do so. I would tell it to turn you over, and it would do so. That is the power of language. And we believed, my grandparents believed in that power. And the belief is indispensable. One must invest language with his belief. I believe in prayer. I believe in prayer and the efficacy of prayer. Not that I can ask for something and it will be given to me, but simply in devotion. You know, I speak because I offer my speech. I offer it to someone or something. And it is an act of devotion. My power consists in my giving my belief to language. And in return, language itself gives me things that I cannot conceive of, a breadth of understanding, a breadth of communication. I don't like the word communication so much. I think it's overused. I prefer expression. When I write, I'm not so much interested in communicating as I am in expressing. Poetry is something that I believe in devoutly. I believe that poetry is the highest form of verbal expression, written verbal expression, because it is written with such care and there is no room for extraneous matter. I did my graduate work at Stanford University, and I worked under a man who was truly a brilliant scholar and a very great man in all respects. His name was Ivor Winters, and he gave me a fellowship. I applied for a Stegner Fellowship to Stanford in creative writing, and he he was in charge of the poetry, and Wallace Stegner was in charge of the fiction part of that program. And I went there as the poetry scholar. Knew nothing, or I should say, I knew very little about poetry. Very little about poetry. And I learned a great deal in my 4 years as a graduate student there, under his direction. He believed in me, and that made a great difference in my life. It was one of the great and most important things that has happened to me in my life. And he could see the form of a poem by listening to it. He could envision it so that he could see the poet, the stanzas and the words in relation to each other. And poetry is directly related to the oral tradition. It is ancient in itself, and many of the poems, poetry comes into being through a process of oral tradition. You say to yourself the poem, and you write it down. And when you communicate it, you say it aloud. Poetry should be read aloud to oneself and to others. It is the sound of it that is so important. And that is that is what distinguishes the oral tradition as well. It is the sound that matters. And the previous speaker talked about the silence, the importance of silence in the oral tradition. And that is indeed one of the great, most powerful parts of oral tradition. The pauses, the reflections, all of that silence is crucial, important. It is not what you say so much at times as it is what you do not say. Not so much what you hear, but what you do not hear. What comes into the mind in a silent way. But it is punctuated with language. That's what gives it its power. That's what gives it its power. Well, I have talked to you about this and that for a time, and I suppose my time is up. But it has been a pleasure to speak to you, and I'm very grateful to talk about this subject with you. We share an interest in something that is very important, that is in its way immortal. And what more can you ask of a thing than that? So, thank you for listening.
Dr. Momaday.
Yes.
Greetings, Susan Feller. Would you mind answering a few questions? I know that we didn't discuss that, but I see that there are a few in the chat.
I'd be delighted to answer.
Thank you. John, are you on?
Yes, I am. And I echo Susan's words on this. What an inspiring couple of sessions from two brilliant writers. Thank you both for this. And we will take a moment to allow for a few questions. So, Susan, Melissa, help me there's some on the chat.
Yeah, not a problem, John. So one of the questions is, Seth, he posted as, it's not really a question, but he said, I would love to hear more about your perspective on the spiritual nature of stories and how that power can be instilled to the people of posterity.
And this is addressed to me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The spiritual, language itself is possessed of spirit. So the spiritual nature of poetry and oral tradition is very great. People at one time, I think, especially in our in our Native American context, people did not speak without intending some spiritual production, some spiritual answer to language itself. We pray, of course, and prayer is vital to Native American oral tradition. I remember my grandmother praying in Kiowa. I couldn't understand what she was saying. She would pray for a long time, and her voice would reverberate in the room. And I had the sense that something very important was going on in the universe when she prayed. And I think that that can be said of most of the oral tradition of our ancestors. I think it has to do with the beginning of language. I talked about that. How did language begin? I think language began in a spiritual context. People talked because they believed in some power beyond the ordinary, some spiritual power. I know that the best poems that I know are spiritual in nature. They call on some spiritual reality or some spiritual imagination beyond reality. And that's important. Now, I don't know whether I've answered the question, but those are the things that come to mind when I think about your question. If I left out something, pose the question again. If not, we'll move on to something else.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, John, I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anyone have any other ones? Lots of praise in the chat and much appreciation for your beautiful presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was wonderful to see you. I hope to see you in person soon.
Good.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you again. Beautiful, very spiritual, and I loved every minute of it. So thank you, Dr. Mama Day.
Are we still
You're
on?
welcome.
I have a comment.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Good afternoon. La Collegetka Matrocha Alawea Japi. My Lakota name is Bear Who Climbs the Tree. I am Lakota from Pine Ridge Reservation. And I always tell people the word prayer in the Western English language means something different. For us Indians, we talk to the Creator and the spirits. Whatever's bothering us, we talk about it. We also want to remind people, I always drive across the prairies and say, and in my language, I say, wow, what a beautiful day. Thank you for giving me my life. I'll do my best to take care of it. So prayer is, for us Indians, is our way of expressing our needs to something greater. And we also ask them to help us. So prayer for us is about talking to a higher power, the Creator, the spirits. And I tell people, just talk, tell them everything that's wrong with you, what you need, what kind of help you need. And then later on, you can say, thank you for helping me. So prayer to me is just talking to something greater and more powerful than me that I can grab onto and rely on. So what an honor to hear you. Thank you. Wapila.
Wise words.
We actually had just a couple more questions come into chat. So one of the questions was, please share any suggestions you have for writing the stories we hear from our elders.
I think you have to be true to what you hear. You know, I wrote about Kosan's time with me and her telling of the Sundance and of other things. And when I was always transcribing these things, I was writing them down. Well, first of all, I had to ask my father, what did she say? And he had wonderful comments to make too about her language. And I think when I was writing these things down, one of the great problems was how can I duplicate her voice, because that is crucial. I wanted people who read her words to hear them, and to hear them in her voice as far as that was possible. So that's something that we might bear in mind when we talk about the transcription of oral tradition. We want to be true to what we hear, and then the writing will take care of itself, perhaps. But that's a good question, and it is. There's a great deal to be learned about that process, and a great deal to be said about it. How do we remain true to the spirit of the oral tradition when somebody tells us a story? How do we keep the spirit of that story in the telling? And that's a problem that was not only ours, but it was also the problem that the reciter of the Beowulf faced. I mean, every ancient example of oral tradition has that spiritual quality that we need to be true to. And I think the people who transcribed the Beowulf way back in time, 9th century, they had to face the same problem. How do we be true to the spirit of what we hear, what we have heard? And if that comes through in the poem, and I think it does, in the written version of the Beowulf, we do have the spirit of the story, and it is a great story. That's what makes it so.
Wonderful. Okay, one last question. Can you speak to visual language, for example, images?
Sure. I think that I often think about this. It's another good question, and it's one that I would like to say something about here. Written language is composed of letters, and each of these letters is a kind of picture. It's an image, and from those abstract images, we gain meaning. You can take that example of imagery in language all the way back to the first man who painted an image on the cave, on a prehistoric cave in Spain or in France, for example. I've visited the Altamira caves in Spain, and these are images basically on the ceiling of a cave, of a room in the cave itself, that are 30,000, or, well, in the case of Altamira, about 17,000 years old. And I went in with a companion to see these images. There were only 5 people admitted at any one time. And so we made up 2 out of the 5. And we walked through the cave, and we came to this great room, which is sometimes called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistoric Art. And there were on the ceiling these wonderful animals. They were all passive. They were grazing. They didn't seem to offer any threat. They were not vicious or ferocious or dangerous. But they were beautiful. And one can see how the artist thought of them by looking at them. He had a great regard for them. He knew what he was doing. And after 17,000 years, we see them for the first time as he saw them. And when my companion and I came out of the cave, we went to the car to drive on. We could not speak. we had seen something so moving, so meaningful in its way, that we had no way of communicating our idea of what we had seen. So we were speechless in the very best way, and that returns to the silence of oral tradition. Imagery is extremely important. I'm writing a book now about the Kiowa migration from the north to the southern plains. And the Kiowas kept calendars, as did the Lakota people, the two tribes who really kept calendars. And so I'm dealing with a Kiowa calendar keeper whose name was Satan, Little Bear. And he, in a ledger book, drew a picture representing the most important event of a certain time. He had no way of writing what he was expressing, no way of enumerating the year that he was expressing. He had only the pictograph. So you see in that instance how important imagery is. We have the calendars preserved, and I loved looking at them because without words, they represent a language that is truly important. This man who was keeping calendars was inventing history, his own idea of history. He had the urge to record the things that were important to him and to his people. And so the calendar, most of the images in the calendars they don't represent anything that we can remember in our own lives, but we understand that they were important to him and his. And it was a family kind of operation, the calendars. He was writing only about things that happened to the people in his tribe. And the whole world was outside that realm, but it was important that he record this. And it's a good thing that he did, because we know much more about the prehistory of the Kiowa tribe than we otherwise would. Imagery is extremely important, and language, writing especially, is composed of imagery. That's it.
Oh, thank you so much. This session has been so inspiring. I'm so grateful that we've all had the opportunity to hear both you and Tim speak, because this gives us substance and meaning to the work that all of us are trying to do so hard, and so with so many challenges. Everybody's working so hard, and it's a great reminder of the purpose underlying the work that we're doing. It adds poetry to the daily lives that we all have. And also this point that both of you made about listening to the silences, that's a takeaway for all of us. And thank you for sharing that. And Scott, I would invite you, if you have time permitting, stick with us for the rest of the day, or as long as you can. And we've got a lot to accomplish in the remaining time this afternoon. And we'll move on to the listening sessions and reporting out on that.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Cordes, and I am the Special Projects Administrator for the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. I just want to take a second to thank everyone for their time and their participation today and yesterday. We have gotten some great feedback in these listening sessions, and our outstanding moderators and managers have helped me compile a kind of Jamboard to discuss some of the common themes. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I see. And I just wanted to preface this with saying that if you do not see your sticky note included on this Jamboard, or don't cover it in the discussion, Please rest assured that ATOM will be using every single sticky note and from every single group to inform how we go forward and to develop and implement a strategic plan to address the future of Indigenous oral histories. So without further ado, the first question was what type of funding, training, and resources were needed to advance oral history programs in Native communities? And we kind of discovered that funding is the root of everything. There is a great need for funding for travel, which includes, travel to conferences to present your important work, as well as supporting Native community members to visit the repositories to actually see and interact with the collections. There's a need for archival supplies, equipment, and software, as well as paying elders for their time, and as well as staff support. Going into training, we saw that there was a need for training in project planning, how to conduct the interviews, how to write deed of gifts, indexing, transcription, digital preservation, as well as having training on the legal aspects of oral history projects. That includes intellectual property rights, copyright laws, and actually writing the protocols and policies to make sure that sensitive and culturally sensitive information is protected. There's also a need for funding and training for grant writers, as well as outreach, how to promote the projects in the community among the general public. Skipping ahead to resources, there's always a need for broadband and tech services. That includes software, equipment, these things that are needed for recording and preserving and storing the data from these projects. There's also resources needed in creating the opportunities to partner with local institutions and other oral history associations. I thought this was a really interesting sticky note that came out of one of our groups, that there's a need for counseling service as we go through this, compassion fatigue and uncovering these what may be traumatic events or information. There was also a stated need for creating comfortable spaces for these interviews, as well as more conferences and seminars like this one to kind of bring people together. The second question that we asked was, how can new life be given to the existing oral histories in the Doris Duke Native American oral history collections? One really interesting part is that this information in the Doris Duke collection can be used to build future curricula. The information in these stories and these oral histories can inform new films, podcasts, radio shows, as well as bring the public together for community gatherings and conversations, community archiving to add and enhance the collections with supporting photos and other media, and as well as to enhance the access of these collections using OHMS, or the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. Our third question asked what type of oral history projects are needed on the community and the national levels. We saw a lot of repetition in preserving language and constructing language curricula. COVID, of course, everybody's feeling that. So preserving these experiences that we've all felt during the pandemic. There on the local level, there's these projects that are needed to preserve and to record traditional ecological knowledge, to record the Indigenous activism on both the past and present, to record the experiences of Native artists, elders, veterans, boarding school survivors, as well as projects that connect youth and elders together. I think yesterday and as well as today, it was brought up that these projects to create maps or StoryCorps maps that connect oral history to the land. And then 2 more was just we need projects that retranscribe some of the original interviews. And just in conclusion on this question, is the main thing that's needed is a sustainable model to create these projects, to have continuous interview practices going forward. The last question asked, how can federal agencies, associations, and funders and others help advance and sustain oral history programs in Native communities? And I just want to say that the biggest one is funding opportunities. There needs to be a reconstruction of how these opportunities are presented to Native communities. That means no requirements for matching funds. Allow the communities to pay for elder contributions to feed the participants during these community gatherings. Funding to pay for the transcription work and the translation work that needs to be done, and to create models that are more sustainable, that goes beyond the 1 or 2 year project timelines. Another thing that was brought up was to build more networking programs and platforms, to provide funds for travel and scholarships, as well for continuous learning. And one of the biggest things, you can see that in all caps down over here on the left, is to hire Native professionals, bring them to the table and actively listen to them when they tell you, do not require us to expect all information to be made public, and to make sure that Native knowledge is not confined to the boundaries of reservations, states, and countries. And I have some wonderful managers and moderators that I want to kind of open up. And did I miss anything? Hearing none, I think I can conclude this part of the listening session report out. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Okay, John.
Yes. Oh, moving right along. That was such a great summary, Jess. You really captured all the good work that all the groups did. So thank you for that. We'll now turn over to some of the legal issues that we've got to think through: the rights of ownership, how oral histories are preserved, getting to even using the evidence to get to deeper levels of truth. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Trevor Reed, who is himself an expert in intellectual property and brings his understanding of how important sovereignty is to our work. He's such a highly respected legal authority and has distinguished himself at the Arizona State University Law School. And this is so helpful to all of us. We've got to think through these issues. So thank you for your help. Trevor, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you, Susan, for the invitation to join you all today. It's certainly a pleasure to be able to be part of this group and to be able to support the work that's going on here. I'll just say from the outset, there's a lot of work happening, a lot of legal research happening on the of Indigenous peoples to sound recordings, archival materials that currently exist in archives around the world. And we're really kind of on the forefront of that effort. And so what I'm going to present to you today is kind of where we're at in terms of these rights. Certainly I could go on for many hours, unfortunately for many people here. I'll try not to, but just know that there's lots to be learned in this space, and we're just trying to make a go of it as we put these things into practice. All right, so my presentation today is titled, Who Owns Our Ancestors' Voices? And that really is the question right now. Not only what rights exist, intellectual property rights, tribal law rights, international rights perhaps, but also how do we go about enforcing rights? You know, if you're an Indigenous knowledge holder or your ancestors were Indigenous knowledge holders, how can you protect that material that may have been recorded? How do we protect oral histories, music, ceremonies, things like that? And for those on the institutional side, how do we go about using these things in a way that's legal? So let me start with a story about somebody who I've been working on and her collection. So this woman is Laura Bolton. Laura Bolton traveled to my homeland many years ago in efforts to gather our sacred ceremonial songs. That was kind of her express purpose. She traveled with a pair of Bureau of Indian Affairs agents in 1940. And there she met three of our tribal leaders, Dan Kutsungva, David Manangya, and Thomas Banakya. And they recorded a number of songs with her, including some that contains material that's restricted in nature under our cultural laws, but also currently under our tribal laws. Now, after a day or two of recording in 1940, in the heat of an August day, Bolton traveled on. She continued on to another location. And she carried her recordings with her. Now, there's no documentation that exists in her voluminous archive about any payments she made to these individuals. There's no agreement reached as to who would own these materials going forward, or whether they could be published or made available to the public. And there's really no indication the tribal leaders actually intended for Bolton to use them for any public purpose going forward. All of these things are important because under the common law rule of the day, and also under Hopi tribal law, rights to unpublished sound recordings generally vested in the performer and not necessarily in the recordist. Or for ceremonially restricted performances, these rights vested in ceremonial performers under tribal law. But being the time that it was, Bolton and her record labels went forward and released this album, Indian Music of the Southwest, in 1941. And then Bolton went on to release another album with Victor Records and ultimately sold something like 5,000 copies of this album through 1986. Of course, since then, many, many more albums have been sold, and you can currently download this on Apple Music or Amazon Music, and you can stream it on Spotify. This recording that otherwise would be restricted under our tribal laws. Ultimately, Bolton decided to transfer all of her rights to her 30,000 recordings that she had made with Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. And she transferred them to Columbia University in exchange for an annuity and a named professorship that she had always wanted. And the value that was ultimately paid for these recordings was something like $1.3 to $2.5 million in today's dollars. So it was a pretty hefty sum. Again, what's important to keep in mind here, though, is that Bolton was a meticulous record keeper, and she was also kind of a shrewd negotiator. I've seen drafts of her contracts with her record labels and other people that worked with her. And she was very careful about her copyright rights, but she signed no contracts with her informants and certainly didn't ever clarify the rights to the materials that she had created with them. Now, none of the tribal members that I've worked with or any of the government leaders that I've worked with had ever heard about these recordings, didn't know that they had been published. And so the question for us now is, what do we do going forward? Who owns these materials and how can those rights be enforced? And I'm sure many of you also have similar questions about oral history collections that you're working with. Who owns these materials and what is the law? What's the legal framework? This is, of course, a drop in the bucket. There are many Indigenous intellectual properties and archives around the world. This is just, of course, a sampling of numbers that I've been able to find. And keep in mind, we don't have numbers about Indigenous intellectual properties that are out there. In the US, there's no central registry of these materials. These are, of course, just objects and collections, but these, of course, might contain multiple intellectual properties, right? A literary work, a musical work on the same recording, a cultural object might contain a design. It might also contain literature. So, there are quite a bit of unknowns in this space. And we just certainly, those of us that are working in this field are trying to get a handle on just how much intellectual property is out there in institutions. We also know that many of these materials were collected or are currently being used in violation of tribal laws, tribal protocols, or tribal standards of care. Sometimes this happened, of course, through unconsented, unethical research practices, bootleg recording, looting, grave robbing. Maybe somebody who wasn't authorized in a community decided to share this material with other people without permission. But the question still is, what duty do institutions owe to our ancestors' voices? What standards do they have to uphold? And what rights do tribes have to enforce those duties? Well, we could break it down essentially into 4 different possibilities for fixing these kinds of abuses of Indigenous intellectual property, ways that we might understand ownership of Indigenous voices going forward. So when can tribes control non-member uses of their ancestors' voices? Well, the first avenue here, and probably the one that we would immediately go to, is that we can look to federal statutes or treaties to provide rights and remedies. Probably the most common would be the Copyright Act, right? And we've seen lots of action on this front. Some of you that may have been following the Sea-Alaska Heritage Institute versus Neiman Marcus case that was going on just a couple of years ago and finally ended in a settlement. The Sea-Alaska Heritage Institute actually asserted their copyright rights in a Raven's Tail coat, along with the descendants of Clarissa Rizal, who was the coat's owner, and was successfully able to get a settlement with Neiman Marcus. And among the things that they were able to get from Neiman Marcus was an agreement to abide by the Tlingit people's laws, intellectual property laws, right? So that was a really interesting example of the way that copyright could actually apply to Indigenous culture going forward, including Indigenous traditional culture. The second avenue, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a second, is tribal law. So tribal law provides sometimes rights and remedies that would be enforceable on tribal members and on tribal lands. The challenge for tribal law is that it's often not enforceable off of tribal lands or against non-members who happen to be doing work with tribal intellectual property outside of a reservation. One example of a tribal law governing intellectual property is this one by the Hopi tribe. It's in the gold box. The Hopi tribe in 1994 developed its own law about what to do with ceremonial or esoteric ritual sound recordings. And it declared all of those to be the property of the Hopi people. By doing that, the tribe could potentially bring an offender into court in its local tribal court and enforce that law. It may also be possible to bring an action against an offender in federal court, right? And be able to enforce that tribal law against somebody who might be subject to the jurisdiction of the tribe. I'll talk more about this in just a second as well. Third, there may be the possibility of tribes enforcing these types of laws against non-members who happen to be on tribal lands when they committed an act and then went off of tribal lands. One case that involved this is Chilkat Indian Village versus Johnson. In that case, the case happened in the 1990s. An individual had come onto the Chilkat Indian Village, and the village had actually passed a law declaring that a certain kind of screen and wooden doorposts that had designs on them were considered tribal cultural property. An individual that had worked in the gallery scene decided to come and purchase some of those materials. And this village law specifically said that these types of materials couldn't be sold. And so when he took them off of tribal lands, he purchased them and removed them, he had violated the village's law. Well, the federal courts actually upheld that tribal law and enforced it against him. We've seen this particular case actually get upheld in the last year. So we presume that it's still good law. I can talk more about that in the Q&A after if anybody's interested. Last but not least, we're seeing an increase in private agreements where institutions are actually agreeing to be bound by tribal law. One way is through these types of protocols, right? The First Nation or the First Archivist Circle protocols that have been recently adopted by, or at least endorsed by the Society for American Archivists and also by the Association of College Research Libraries. And we're seeing increasingly that institutions like Arizona State University and many others are creating internal policies to enforce these. It may also be that we'll see more and more individuals agreeing to be bound by tribal laws going forward, especially researchers working with tribal intellectual property. Okay, let me dig just a little bit deeper into each of these to talk about how these types of rights work, especially for those of you that have a little bit more expertise in copyright law. I want to explain a little bit more about some of the nuances that we're talking about here. Well, so copyright law, it covers a long list of things here in the orange box, but it essentially gives people a temporary and a limited right to keep other people from reproducing a creative work that the copyright owner owns. That means making copies, maybe even uploading the creative work to a computer. It also prevents people from deriving new works from that original creative work. Maybe that's like making a film version out of a book, or maybe transcribing audio. It also prevents people from distributing copies of a work. That could be selling copies, posting them on social media. And certainly it prevents people in some cases from publicly performing or publicly displaying a work or digitally streaming a sound recording. These are all very powerful rights, but they're also quite limited in some ways. You've all heard about fair use as a potential limitation. You know, a fair use of a work, one that's done for a public purpose and it meets all of the other requirements of the balancing test, isn't an infringement of copyright. We also have an archival preservation exception that also prevents copyright law from being enforced. But whatever the case is, copyright law is pretty powerful. If you use a work of somebody else's, you know, let's say you use somebody else's musical composition, or maybe you use somebody else's literature, without their permission, you could be liable for some significant amounts of money, right? Up to $150,000 per instance of willful infringement. An injunction may also be available. The court hearing the case might say, sorry, you can't use this creative work anymore for this purpose. Among all of the different categories that are available for protection are sound recordings. But it's important to kind of talk a little bit about what is protected in sound recordings and how the law has recently changed. So for a long time, sound recording copyrights were only protected under state laws. So states, for example, would adopt anti-piracy laws to protect record labels from having their recordings copied and distributed without their permission. And a number of state courts also adopted something called common law copyright. So the court said, you know, if you take somebody else's sound recording without permission, that just doesn't sound right. And we're going to protect it as just kind of a common law rule that we have in our case law. Well, and that was how things worked for a long time up until the 1970s. But after 1972, Congress actually stepped in and added sound recordings to the list of things that could be protected by our federal copyright laws. Federal copyright laws, as I just mentioned, have these really strong remedies where if you infringe somebody's work under federal law, you could be liable for up to $150,000 per instance of infringement. Well, just a few years ago, in 2018, Congress passed something called the Music Modernization Act. And included within the Music Modernization Act was a special provision for these older recordings. So even today, under the Music Modernization Act, those people that own these older recordings under these state laws or these state common law rules, if you have a copyright to an old work like Aretha Franklin's work, or maybe you own something by the Beatles made prior to that time, then you would still own it under state law, but federal law now protects it. So if somebody were to infringe your copyrighted song recording, you could go into federal court and ask for those big hefty remedies that federal law provides. So, you know, the state right creates the right, you know, the state law creates the right, and then federal law enforces it. What's interesting about the wording of the Music Modernization Act is that it doesn't distinguish between state sound recording rights and tribal sound recording rights. In fact, there's nothing in there. It just says that if you have rights to a recording that was made prior to 1972, then you could potentially enforce that using federal law. This could be really useful because many tribes have now created their own intellectual property laws, including rights to sound recordings. And those sound recording rights might be enforceable using this federal framework. One thing that I want to point out, though, is that this new federal mechanism for enforcing sound recording rights does add in a couple of things. It adds in a fair use provision. It adds in the archival preservation exception that I just mentioned earlier. It also adds in the non-commercial use safe harbor, which is something brand new that we hadn't seen in our copyright law before. This is kind of an orphan works provision where if you can't find the copyright owner to a particular work and you want to use this work for non-commercial purposes, you can go ahead and do so after a certain window of time passes and you've submitted the request out there into the world. You've done a due diligence search to find whether or not the copyright owner is out there. As long as you give notice, after a certain period of time, you can go ahead and use that creative work without permission. This could be really detrimental for Indigenous creative works, especially Indigenous sound recordings. As you know, folks in the non-commercial industries, research industries, perhaps other nonprofit organizations might be able to use these materials without asking anybody's permission, just by doing a search and going through that process of providing notice. So this is something to flag as something to think about. All right, what about tribal law? Tribal law is really interesting in that some tribes, I think now the number is up to 50. Angela Riley has done a recent compilation of those. Tribal laws certainly are protecting Indigenous intellectual properties. But many tribes also protect them through traditional or customary laws. Let me just share a brief example from my work with the Hopi tribe. As part of our work to return Laura Bolton's recordings back to the tribe, we actually worked with members of our community, stakeholders, ranging from high school students all the way up to our elders, corporate leaders to nonprofit leaders, to find out what our community's laws are for protecting recordings like the ones Laura Bolton made. And we were able to come up with a series of categories, kind of our customary law or our protocols around the treatment of sound recordings. And this table lists just a couple of those categories, but these kinds of rights are enforceable in our tribal courts. And so it's very possible that in the future, if somebody abuses our ancestors' voices, somebody could bring action under one of these kinds of customary rights. Of course, not every tribal court recognizes customary law, but many do. And I think this is an important avenue for us to develop, especially those of us working on the legal side, to better understand tribal IP. Another option might be NAGPRA, right? We think about NAGPRA as only applying to objects in museums and other types of federal agencies and requiring repatriation of them. But when it comes down to it, sound recordings are objects, right? They're physical, tangible objects, and often they would meet the categorical definitions of sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony. So, you know, the question is, would NAGPRA potentially apply to a sound recording, and would it apply to any copies made of a sound recording, especially if they meet these two definitions? Right now here at ASU Law, we're working on research to find out, to answer that question. You know, what would happen if somebody were to sue under NAGPRA to be able to repatriate sound recordings from archives and universities? You know, what kinds of rights would NAGPRA provide to things like that? And I'm happy to talk more about that research in the Q&A. Finally, I want to talk about some of these private arrangements. I mentioned the Society for American Archivists and the American College Research Library's endorsement of the first Archivist Circle protocols. Other institutions have taken different approaches as well. You know, some of these organizations have essentially recognized tribal intellectual property rights explicitly, but others merely just give deference to tribes in their decision-making. Some of these acknowledge that when you take ancestors' voices and misuse them, you're actually harming Indigenous peoples, while others appear to be more interested in just kind of being more inclusive in management and decision-making. And these protocols vary widely about the kinds of remedies that are available. Some of these require consultation. Others require repatriation if these recordings were taken without permission or without consent. And some just give tribes input on how to categorize these materials, like the APS protocols essentially just give tribes the ability to give input on whether something is culturally sensitive whatever that means. I'm not quite sure what that means in that context. So, there's just a huge spattering of different ways of approaching this at the institutional level. I think, though, while protocols are good and a great step, they aren't enforceable. They aren't binding on institutions. And I think that's the direction we need to go. I'm going to breeze through the next couple of slides just to explain what I think could happen next, right? How should the law develop going forward? Well, we have, this is kind of a technical slide, but we have something that's widely known as privately ordered licensing networks. Maybe you've heard of Creative Commons. Maybe when you signed up to do social media, maybe your Facebook account, you clicked OK to a licensing agreement. These types of agreements follow this model of privately ordered licensing, where when you click OK, you become bound to that particular organization's rules and laws through a private contract. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that as Indigenous peoples, right? Require that the institutions that hold our ancestors' voices become bound to certain agreements. And not only that, they become bound to our own tribal laws, that they require that any user of our ancestors' voices also become bound to our tribal laws. As I mentioned earlier, private agreements can do this, right? You can agree to be subject to tribal law, even if you live off of tribal lands. Through a private contract. So this may be very empowering for tribes. This is kind of the schematic of what it might look like, right? Where the tribe acts as both the rights holder and a regulator, right? And sets forward these conditions and sends them out into the world using this mechanism. All right, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. I'd love to answer any of your questions. I realize, I'm running a little late, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. And of course, I could also answer them offline if you have any thoughts or questions. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
You have a question, Veronica? Oh, you're on mute.
I was going to ask you, how does all this copyright comport with a standard provision in federally funded programs that say the copyright belongs to the federal government for all its funding? And one of the reasons I think they get away with it is because they are one of the few agencies that fund us, some of our language programs.
Yeah, so this is one of the big challenges. Lots of federal grants require that intellectual property be transferred federal government, or that you don't have any proprietary interest in it, that the results of research become part of the public. And I think that is one of the drawbacks sometimes of federal funding. And it may be possible, of course, to negotiate out those aspects. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this intellectual property existed prior to any of these types of federal grants. And so, let's say you get a federal grant to work with a pre-existing oral history archive or pre-existing collection. Those rights will certainly persist, even though the derivative works that you create through the process of research, maybe those might be owned by the federal government. But I think it is true. I mean, this is an area of concern and certainly something that tribes should be aware of. And I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay. I've got one more question, and that has to do with the tribe's claim to intellectual property of like recordings or even stories. What makes the tribe say we're the owner of this when it was done maybe by an individual? Does not, in that case, does the intellectual property and copyright belong to the individual and their family instead of the tribe? And how do you separate the two? Because a lot of those stories that the individual may know is also something that belongs to the entire tribe.
Right, and this is a really important part of what I think many of us are working on right now is, our way of doing intellectual property at the tribal level may be really different from what copyright thinks should happen, right? So under copyright law, the person that creates the work is the copyright owner, right? But in many communities, it's not just the person that maybe sings a song or, maybe somebody that tells a particular story that is the owner. It may be that it's the knowledge holders or a particular clan, or maybe a particular family, or maybe a particular house, right, that maintains that knowledge and that way of expressing it that would be the owners. So under copyright law, we may have a different result at a different owner than under tribal law. And I think this is one of the key areas that tribal law could be really beneficial. What's interesting is that there's never been a case, a federal court case, that has decided which comes first, tribal law or federal copyright law. There's currently a completely ambiguous question whether one takes precedence over the other. We don't know the answer to that. At least the Supreme Court has never answered that. But there are many arguments to be had that tribal law should take precedence in this particular arena. I'm happy to share more of my research on that front with you, but yeah, I think there really is a conflict there, although, it may be that tribal law will take the day, and it may be that the tribe's ownership structure will be ultimately upheld over anything that copyright would require.
Great, thank you. So another question we have, Trevor, is any suggestions on how an information professional can get educated or well-versed on these topics without necessarily getting a law degree? Is there a certificate program, or for those who may be considering more education or have access to a law school, any particular courses?
Yeah, so fortunately, I think a lot of universities, a lot of law schools these days are now offering either an LLM program if you already have a law degree, or kind of an MLS kind of a law degree, a Master of Legal Sciences, or something along those lines. So here at ASU, we have a number of certificate or master's level programs where you can come to the law school, take some foundational intellectual property classes, and also take some of our specialized classes. So for example, I teach a specialized intellectual property and social change class where we deal with topics involving, how do we undo colonization? How do we deal with, racial justice in the intellectual property world? But again, a lot of these topics involving indigenous intellectual property are just barely percolating up, right? And we're just now developing programs to help facilitate these conversations. So just keep an eye out. We'll have much more in the future. Here at ASU, we'll be having a conference on indigenous intellectual property coming up next academic year. So I'll be sure to email you all so you can hopefully jump into that. And some of our panels will cover these types of things, in addition to, data sovereignty and many other things that are related to this topic.
Great. Okay. Another question is, please share your thoughts on what would be the best way to market tribal holdings without infringing on the tribe's privacy of some items.
So, right, the problem of metadata, how much metadata should be available for the public to peruse, I think is one question that a lot of people are wondering about. Certainly what rights do tribes have in metadata? Can they curtail any of that? I think it really is a case-by-case situation. Certainly, I think repositories need to make information available about their holdings so that tribes can find it. At the other end, a lot of the metadata that has been collected is very sensitive and contains material that's protected under tribal laws. So I think it's really up to the institution and the repository to consult with the particular tribe and find out what laws they have regarding this kind of information. Would you be disclosing the know-how that's protected by the tribe, the traditional knowledge, by putting this particular kind of metadata out there into the world? I think, at some point it would be fantastic to have a repository or at least a database of all intellectual properties, indigenous intellectual properties that are out there, but it would have to be safeguarded and certainly tailored to each tribe's particular needs. So I think it's a conversation to be had and certainly done in consultation with each tribe.
Wonderful. One other question is, who owns work for hire?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of times when a researcher came out to tribal lands to do some sort of recording project, they were paid by a particular institution to do that. They were under contract or were an employee of that particular organization. So there are very specific and somewhat technical rules regarding who owns that material. If you were, just to speak generally, if you're an employee of an institution and you're working within the scope of your employment, that creative work product that you produce will usually be owned by the employer as opposed to you. Now, in this context, though, one of the challenges is that with sound recordings that were made back in the day, prior to 1972, the real question is whether or not, or who in the recording relationship was actually the copyright owner. Would it have been the recordists and their institution, or would it have been the indigenous interlocutor, the person that was actually answering all the questions or performing? Under those old common law rules, the actual owner of the copyright probably would have been the performer. But if you are in a situation where the performer has perhaps signed away their rights to the institution, or maybe the performer was hired by the institution, then those work made for hire rules might actually make that material the property of the institution rather than the individual. It's really hard to say, though, and the tests for this were different back then as well. There was an instance and expense test. So if you worked at the instance and expense of an institution, then your work would become theirs. Nowadays, it's a much more complicated test, and you would have to actually be an employee of the institution. So, back in the day, a lot of times people worked for just like a small amount, right, just as an independent contractor. And so there are some debates about whether that would have qualified as a work made for hire or not. Anyway, happy to talk more about that offline, but that would be the kind of short answer.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Trevor. I know we have a lot more questions, but we're hoping that Trevor will present at ATOM 2022 this fall, and more on this topic. So I think we will continue on. Thank you again.
All right, thank you all.
Great. Trevor, I so appreciate what you put on the table, because you've given us all a sense of urgency and how important it is to get on the timeline and making all this work. Cecilia Fire Thunder posted a comment: tribes need this information as soon as possible. So we'll do everything we can at ATOM to make that a reality. So Melissa and Susan, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, and it's with great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Rumeli Benick, who is our champion at Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. I've had the pleasure of working directly with her through the Child Wellbeing Program at the foundation, and seeing her at close range at work with this national cohort. I see a demonstration in every breath of great leadership, of profound active listening, and bringing out the best from all of us. She understands not only the questions and comments put on the table, but what is driving the question behind the question, if you will. Her approach is very much using the evidence before us to make a point that moves the conversation, the dialogue about very complex issues forward. There is with her a profound sense of and spirit of generosity. And I want to remind everyone on this call today that she is our strong advocate for advancing this good work. And I'm glad that we can all bear witness to all of the presentations today. And I look forward to hearing what she has to share with us. Take it away.
Thank you, John, for that really kind introduction. And thank you all for having me here. Thank you to Susan and Melissa and ATOM for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for for joining in this meeting. I do want to acknowledge that I live and work on the original homelands of the Mcilvane people. And on behalf of myself and my DDCF colleagues, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, we acknowledge and honor this history and recognize the ongoing dedication and importance of Indigenous culture to the lands and communities with whom we live, learn, and work. So first, I want to start off with what an amazing 2 days. I'm just so honored to be a part of all of this. The energy that you all bring to these discussions and your level of engagement, it's palpable. I appreciate the generosity of in sharing knowledge and resources and your contributions in the breakout sessions. So I can only imagine and hope for what the energy and excitement will feel like when we're all able to be in person, if this is what's happening through the virtual environment. So, and I hope that that is soon. In 2019, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation connected with John Hayworth, with ATOM, and with the universities housing the Doris Duke Oral History collections to learn more about their content, history, and how we could support their continued use and sustainability. And in these last few years, my colleagues and I have been impressed by the progress that's been made, and in this relatively short amount of time, the preservation and digitization of the recordings, the addition of new materials and photographs and things like that complement the recordings, the partnerships that have been developing and growing, and the community building. And so we recognize the importance, the uniqueness, the cultural significance, and the richness of these collections. A couple of years ago, I read To Be an Indian in Oral History that was written by Herbert T. Hoover and Joseph H. Cash in 1971 about the collections that are at the University of South Dakota. And just being able to read, I didn't have access to the recording, so being able to read about first person accounts of experiences on the reservation, of boarding schools, of the Great Depression, and life in the 1960s. But also a lot of these recordings, as many of you have pointed out, are from elders. I mean, there were people that were talking about their experiences from the late 1800s, and a lot of that would have been lost if it weren't part of these collections. So I really got a taste of the richness of these collections. As Tim Tingle talked about, these recordings and the power that they have, so excited to be part of how we can increase access to these collections so that Native communities and tribes can, have their stories and hear about and learn more about the history of their cultures, and so that broader public can really access and learn about Native traditions and culture and history. I also like to think about the impact that these recordings have had on researchers. We heard yesterday from Diana Repp and Susan Penfield, Susan, who was part of the original project, and Diana, who has shown us the potential of how these recordings can contribute to, and how these collections can contribute to scholarly contributions. I also think about the impact on the people that contributed, the tribes that contributed, and now as the curation teams, the community curation teams, are listening to these recordings and reviewing them, how they are feeling. And I just it just really emphasizes how important it is that we cannot and that we will not allow these materials to be forgotten. So the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation remains committed to increasing access and visibility and use of the Doris Duke oral history collections and other Native narratives. We want to honor the original goals of and objectives of these collections to gather diverse perspectives and experiences of Native peoples and tribes, but also to return these stories back to the families and the communities who shared their stories. And so over the next few months and years, we'll continue to work with ATOM, with universities and with Native tribes and communities on elevating these stories, on strengthening partnerships among the universities housing the collections and the tribes. As many of you in your contributions to the breakout during the breakout session talked about, really creating and supporting the creation of educational and scholarly materials, of curricula and other content around these collections. We also hear about the technical aspects of this, and so we'll continue being a partner in supporting a platform for increased access and use, and for the technology that it requires to address some of these access issues. We're also excited about providing resources and supports and connections to our partners who might be helpful as this process evolves, and looking at how we can support broader public engagement with these stories. So I know that this session is entitled Envisioning the Future, and really I turn that back to all of you. So I ask you, how can we continue how can the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and how can I help to continue to share your vision for the future of these stories, and really sustaining the importance of this work? We strongly believe that Native communities and tribes and ATOM and you all must lead us and guide us on what the next steps are. So let's continue to dream big and inspire each other to dream big as we think about what the future of these collections and other Native narratives hold. Thank you.
John, would you indulge me while I say a few words to Romelli? Thank you. I just want to say thank you very much, and thanks Sam for yesterday, and thank you to the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for your indulgence with us and for allowing us to return the materials to the tribes and to have them decide what kind of respectful access they should have. Because I know that when we started the project, it was with the intention that we increase access and use, and you and Sam and everyone at the DDCF saw the need to allow the tribes to make that determination. And so we thank you for that. And we thank you for your continued commitment. We thank you for this renaissance with Native oral histories. I think the future looks very bright. So with that, again, you know how I feel. And I'll turn it back to you, John.
Oh, thank you so much. I think this is like a perfect wrap up for our session today. But we're going to now transition into having an opportunity for any last words or any comments or final questions or anything you want to share. We're monitoring the chat and we're ready to go, and we'll take comments and questions next.
All right, feel free to speak up if you have any questions or to put them in the chat.
And if you don't, we don't have to stay.
Right.
So
Well, and I think actually some of these, the intensity of these last, I mean, my goodness, these last incredible sessions, it's just mind-boggling. We've got so much to think about and so many actions to take. And I also so appreciate the specificity of the suggestions during the breakout sessions to say, let's do this, let's do that, and figuring out how we're going to do it, and that really taking this, digesting the information. I also love the fact that so many of the comments were, I didn't know this and I need to know more, and help us and do a session and post something on the website. And so, as always, the hands are full with all of the ATOM staff. They work tirelessly, but there's even more to do. But I think what all of you have left us with is tremendous inspiration to carry out this work and a commitment. I know this has been energetic for all of us. So thank you all for such a high level 2 days.
I just wanted to also add, Trevor has been a wonderful asset to us, along with other attorneys who have helped us navigate the legal process of working with these collections. And they are the ones who advised us to really engage the tribes, and that we should put tribal considerations above any laws. And that's what we fully intend to do. And I see that Cecilia has her hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. I know Tal was on this call from Oglala Lakota College. My question is, let me just back up a little bit. At a regional level, who's doing what for the Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota? And so who's doing what in those regions so we can collaborate even more? Because as I'm listening these last 2 days, I learned so much. But it seems that there's a population of people out there in our communities who need to know this as well. But most importantly, I just feel so strongly about our collections and our, I've been here, there, and everywhere, and I've been fortunate enough to get into some of those collections. And each time I leave, I cry, because those are our ancestors, and how can we bring them home? Thank you.
We hear you, Cecilia. Some of it is just, it's very emotional and very draining to listen to the recordings. But South Dakota, that would be the University of South Dakota. Is Sam on?
Yes, he is.
Great.
Yes.
Sam, would you like to address that?
About the, I'm sorry, what was the?
How to engage with the community?
Oh, yeah, we've, of course, we've had, good contacts through our staff, or through our project team with Gavin Spotted-Tail in particular, being from Rosebud community, and Damon Leader-Charge, our director of tribal outreach, is also from Rosebud. But as I think some of the other project teams are doing, they're we started working with kind of smaller surrounding, tribes that may not be smaller, but the collections that we have are smaller. So we kind of worked with groups that we, on this project, groups that we'd already worked with somewhat. We had returned something like 20 oral histories to the Santee Dakota tribe in Nebraska. And they were wanting those to put up on a kiosk within a tribal museum. So that might be one option there with regards to, maybe tribal members don't personally have internet, but maybe they don't live quite so far from, say, the tribal headquarters or tribal museum. And so, but we've been trying to make it as in person as possible. I know a number of the other repositories made that comment. I think we found that almost without exception that, we're eager to get past the pandemic, of course, as everyone is, but the importance of face-to-face and showing people in person that, this is a project of benefit to the tribe, not just, something that is beneficial to graduate students or even just USD, but is a mutually beneficial project, and that the tribes will be very much involved in. So we tried to accentuate those points, and I think we've had success so far. We're eager for the summer, especially now with South Dakota. Now that the weather hopefully is turning the corner, that we'll make some real progress in the next few months.
Thanks, Sam. Also on the website, the Archive of Native American Oral History, there is an area there. If you are a representative community in the collection, you can let us know that you have an interest in starting to work with the with your recordings, because one of the most labor-intensive things about this project is connecting the repositories with the tribes. And so if the originating communities want to get started on it, let us know and we'll connect you with the repositories and we'll get started.
Great. One of the questions we had in the chat, Susan, was can you talk about the survey of Native American oral history and what we can expect if we participate in the survey?
Thank you. It's a fairly simple survey, and it's primarily to get a better idea of what's out there, who has already collected what they would like to collect in the future, what your needs are. A lot of the same questions that you answered today in the listening session are also included in that oral history survey. And what you will get from it, I hope, is I think that we may get more out of it. And for that, I apologize, but we need to know how we can be of most help to you. We will publish the results and you'll have an opportunity to provide further input on it. Then we'll probably do a final report on it at the ATOM conference in October 2022. And let me know if I answered your question or if you have any guidance for us on it.
All right. So are there any other questions?
I have a comment to say a fire thunder. I have in my hands a book I picked up in Mille Lacs, Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, written by a gentleman named Antone Treuer, and it was everything you wanted to know about Indians but were afraid to ask. And in it, and I just enjoyed it, you know, because here again, as Native people, as Indian people, we get asked a lot of dumb questions, you know, about being Indian. This really is quite an amazing book, you know. And then so he puts pictures and historical pieces in here, and I was going to put it on my Facebook page and have everybody get a copy of it, you know. Even like, did Indians practice polygamy? Did Indians scalp? Why did natives scalp? Were natives more violent than white? When did natives really get to North America? It's a great little resource book, and I really enjoyed it. So I was going to share that with. So I guess what I want to get to is that sometimes in the state of South Dakota, where I live, even though we live next to non-native people, they don't know anything about us, and we don't know anything about them. And case in point, I live in a little town called Martin, South Dakota. And the reservation line runs in and out of my community. But it's really interesting as I talk to white people, they have a lot of misconceptions about who we are. But you know, one thing that I know really brings us together is art. You know, art in any manner, shape, or form opens up discussions that you can't open up in any other format. So we still have a long way to go just to create some harmony within the whites and Indians in the state of South Dakota. Thank you.
I think an increase in understanding, which can be had through these historic recordings, will further that. And we love Anton. He has a new book that you may be interested in as well. I can't remember the name of it right now, but he's one of our favorite people. I was wondering, art. We agree with you. And the Ford Foundation just gave us a grant to help 6 Native communities create arts councils. And so, you know, we're hoping that any of you that are still on this call, if you're interested in starting an arts council, that application closes on April the 29th. Is that correct, Melissa?
Yes.
And it's available on our website. So we'll provide, and John, You should be talking about this project.
Yeah, one thing that's come up in the conversation the last 2 days is about the incredible resources and organizations, from universities to tribal libraries to Native advocacy organization, all of it, and getting to know one another. I think part of the good work that ATOM does is not only building individual strength in topic areas like oral history, but also building the strength of our field. And I have always felt that ATOM has a special gift for working very well with other organizations, making partnerships, and we've got a lot of really strong and positive Native leaders throughout the country that are very much on board with this work. And I think doing local cultural inventories of knowing what the assets are in our regions and I think this project that Susan referenced, it's a very important initiative. Ford Foundation is given some seed money to make this happen, and we're going to go through the process of selecting the 6 tribal communities and figuring it all out. So stay tuned, everybody.
Arden, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. Please, the floor is yours. Melissa, I can't see if people have their hands up.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up either.
Thank you.
I apologize.
Thank you. I do in my text message, but I just want to say thank you for these 2 days, with a lot of genuine wealth of information, which is really, really helpful, and it allows us at least, a stepping stone in the direction on perhaps maybe really getting together on looking at all these resources of information that tribes could, look at as a clearinghouse, and how this could help a lot of some of the problems that we run into, like here in Zuni Pueblo. So thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
All right, any other questions?
I think we're all tired.
No, we're exhilarated.
Yes, that's true.
Yes, and inspired.
Okay.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions.
Well, but before we go, this is your horse capture. Thank you for the ATOM team for organizing this. So everybody give a big yay, thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And Joe, thank you for those kind words. Do you want to put a plug in for your upcoming seminar?
Sure. So I here at the Archery, we're hosting on April 22nd, 23rd, the Marshall McKay seminar for the empowerment of Native knowledge. It'll be our first seminar. The first day will deal with Native arts and museums. And the first day will deal with Native museums, the importance of tribal museums, and reflections on from Native curators. Second day, the 23rd, will deal with Native arts. Everybody's welcome to attend virtually since we're here in Los Angeles. You don't want to come here now because today's 93 degrees. You can find the information on our website, just theautry.org.
That's great. Behind you, is that your new research center?
It is. That's the research center. Yep.
That's beautiful. That's cool. Well, and you did tell everybody how they can register for that. And John's going to be speaking
He will
about.
be. Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
I know, John, we're really working you, aren't we?
Yes, you are. It's great. My pleasure.
Great. Okay. Well, if anybody, any other questions, we'll stay on as long as you want. Well, John,
we had one question from Jill, an offer of help. And she said she was wondering if we were utilizing court reporters to transcribe oral histories. She would be interested in doing work for our project. So apparently the National Court Reporters Association has a Veterans Oral History Project ongoing.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes. we would definitely be interested in that. I don't know anything about using court reporters to transcribe, but it's good. So, okay, great.
Great. Okay, well.
Good. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.